Oh, Nieh, thank you so much for having me at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's headquarters here we're in Rockville, Bethesda. Where is this?
Rockville, Maryland.
Rockville,
But it's
Maryland.
pretty close to Bethesda. I suppose you could call it North Bethesda.
Yes, yes. So you're the director of the Office of Nuclear Reactor Regulation, NRR. That's how you guys refer to
NRR,
it.
yes.
Thank you so much for taking the time today.
And thanks for having me. It's a great opportunity, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to start with your story. I know that your dad was a nuclear welder. Is that right?
That's right.
That's how you knew about the space to begin with.
Sort of. So he was a nuclear welder. He went to different power plants in the northeastern United States. I grew up in New York City, and I remember seeing my dad coming home with T-shirts from different outages from different nuclear power plants. I had no idea what that meant. I mean, I was, maybe a elementary school kid, but growing up, he always kind of steered me towards science and technology and encouraged me to study engineering in university. And I had gone to New York State Merchant Marine Academy, and I enrolled with a minor in nuclear engineering, but they actually had canceled their program. And this is the late 80s, early 90s. So I ended up just getting a kind of a straight up mechanical engineering degree. But then afterwards, I went through the Navy nuclear program working at one of their prototype plants. So that's kind of how I got there. I didn't really grow up necessarily with a fascination of nuclear power plants, but I knew about them, right? And I knew when I was a high school student, I remember watching the television when the Chernobyl accident happened in 1986. But I never had a fear of nuclear energy growing up, especially having a dad that worked in the industry and then going in through the Navy program. I understood that the technology can be used very safely and it can be used for a lot of different purposes. So that's kind of how I ended up getting into nuclear. And then, of course, after working at the Navy prototype plant in upstate New York, I joined the NRC as a resident inspector.
It sounds to me like you had like the classic engineer mindset. Don't impose values on any given technology. Just look at it objectively and see, kind of pick at all the parts of it, from that way.
Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate, Brett, when I think about that. And it's funny, if I reflect back going through school to study engineering and then going back to grad school to study engineering, that mindset certainly was inside of me. But as I took on different positions at the NRC, I had gone back to business school as well, and I started to really learn that the world is not a black and white world, and certainly the engineering principles can really ground you in how you approach problems and how you approach issues. But in looking at how to regulate, it isn't often black and white, and I felt that early on in my career, I had just an opportunity to work for a brief period of time under a former NRC Chairman Richard Meserve, just for 4 to 6 months or something like that. He was bringing people from different parts of the NRC organization through his office. And that was a great experience for me because having the technical background, the engineering background, and the inspection background, getting that glimpse into how public policy decisions are made, looking at the deliberative process, I think really helped me see a bigger picture.
So how does that work organizationally? Paint the picture for me. Is this something that's NRC specific? Is this something that's all government agency specific, where they try to have their employees kind of rotate through various jobs and get a peek into policy, get a peek into leadership? Is that common amongst different government agencies?
I can't actually speak to that because I haven't worked in any other government agencies, although I have worked in other international organizations that are sort of non-governmental, but work that are comprised of government organizations and countries that, like the International Atomic Energy Agency and the Nuclear Energy Agency. And I do know people that work in other federal agencies, and I have heard instances where people go from different types of assignments to broaden their experiences and the things that they get to work on. So I can't really say for sure if that's commonplace throughout federal government, but I would say here at NRC, it's fairly common to see a lot of people go through different types of positions in the agency. For a long period of time, we really advocated for our leadership and our executives to take on different assignments, that they should work in different program offices, reactors, materials, security, even policy.
And what do you learn as you switch between these offices? Do you have any concrete examples of when you thought one way about, when you were thinking of something from an engineering perspective, and then all of a sudden you had to put on a policy hat, and you're like, oh my God, I'm just seeing this problem totally differently now.
In some cases, yes, because I used to work in the Office of Nuclear Security and Incident Response right after the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. And you go from the world of inspection and nuclear power plant reactors and looking whether the safety systems are available, whether they're going to do the functions that they were designed to do, to going into a very different world of security. How do you protect a facility from a potential attack? How do you prepare effectively for emergencies and things of that nature? So it didn't really rely exactly on all the things I learned about nuclear power plants. I mean, of course, it was really important because you needed to know what could go wrong at a facility if it were attacked and what could lead to a radiological release. But it certainly had you come about it with a different mindset, because now you're trying to think like what a bad guy would do to a power plant. And what's really interesting about that is, I think, if somebody from that environment comes to work in the let's say the regular licensing organization of reactors, where we're not focused on security because we have a separate office to do that, that individual now has to try to figure out and learn how we're approaching licensing, right? We're not necessarily looking at things from a security perspective, because we have an office of security that does that work for us. So I think when you go to these different offices and acquire these different experiences, you just see how decisions are made. One thing that I believe is important for the regulatory body, though, and I'm kind of pointing to the books that are on the table. I leave them there all the time,
because 10 CFR, CFR 10. Yeah.
Yep, because those are our regulations, and one of the first questions I always get to when an issue comes up where we have to make a decision, well, what do the regulations require? I mean,
to talk me through that, what is the founding principles of nuclear regulations? Because I remember I was at a talk recently where Bill Magwood, for the audience, former NRC commissioner, he said that it's founded on this concept of adequate protection, but I don't know what that word adequate means. So how does adequate compare to CFR 10, the book in front of us? What is all that?
So obviously it is based on adequate protection, and what we would believe that the regulations provide for is that reasonable assurance of adequate protection. And that's one thing that the agency historically has never defined.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing in your opinion, that it's left ambiguous?
I think it's a good thing. And it relies on things such as engineering judgment, this term we use called Defenseindepth, which is multiple layers of protection. Because ultimately what we're trying to get at with adequate protection is we want to protect the public and the environment, right? There's radioactive material that can pose a hazard, and we want to make sure that the public is adequately protected from that. But one thing I would say to maybe help you think about it is that adequate protection does not mean zero risk. Okay? If we were to do everything to regulate to eliminating all risks,
that would eliminate all power plants.
Yeah, just say no to everything, right? Shut down all the nuclear power plants, look for some other source of electricity. Don't use nuclear materials for beneficial medical treatments and things of that nature, or other industrial processes. Just say no. I mean, that reduces the risk.
But that's super challenging, striking that balance between minimizing risk but not zero risk, adequate with a vague definition. How do you think about that within the organization of the NRC? What kind of conversations happen in these walls to narrow in on a definition?
Yeah. So I'm glad you asked that question, because right now you've probably heard the NRC is going through a major evolution to transform itself. We've embarked on this journey of change, and we've been driving ourselves to be the so-called modern risk-informed regulator, right? That's been something that was developed, let's say maybe in 2018. There was an effort to help transform the organization to become a modern risk-informed regulator. There were some options that were proposed to look at some things in our regulatory framework. And so that's a real big focus right now, to really help understand what being risk-informed means and what reasonable assurance means. So we talk about not regulating to zero risk. So in practice, how does that work? Well, making a decision on a regulatory action, we're concerned about risks, right? And risks, if you look it up in the dictionary, I think it talks about exposure to injury or loss or some type of hazard, right? And we can apply that certainly in what we do. And what we try to think about when we apply risk insights to our decision making to get to adequate protection, right? And that reasonable assurance of adequate protection is we ask ourselves, what can go wrong? How likely is it, and what are the consequences? And we call that the risk triplet. And I think that's a great framework to apply not only for technical issues, but I would say even in some of the legal things that we talk about here, I think that's a framework you could use as well.
Can you dive into each one of those three a little bit more?
Yep. So in the world of nuclear reactors, which is my world right now, NRR is responsible for the operating reactors in the United States, as well as the non-power reactors, such as those at universities and research institutes. In October, we are going to include now the new reactors activities that we're working. So
right, so you're part of this combining two different departments.
We're reunifying
and you're
the
in charge
offices.
Of it.
Yep, it's all the span of control will increase significantly come October 13th. But I'm really excited about it because there's a great opportunity to
shuffle some things up.
Absolutely. So going back to those components of risk in the reactor world, but I'd say also for the new reactor world, we do have an advantage that helps our decision making because over the last, now it's probably like close to 30 years as what we call probabilistic risk assessment technology has developed, those tools are really giving us insights into, how likely something could be and what are those potential consequences. So we have that tool in the reactor world to help inform our decisions. And I would say that it's not just about this tool, like crunching a number and looking at how likely a core damage event is or how likely a release from the site would be, right? You calculate a number in scientific notation and, it's useful because it gives us a relative sense of how important something is, but you still have to take into consideration other factors such as the margins that are built into the design of the facility, like the high quality materials and things like that, and the deterministic criteria that are in the regulations that provide some margins to getting to fuel damage and ultimately a release. You need to look at what measures of Defenseindepth are in place. Maybe there are some mitigation strategies that, a plant can put in place if a certain component's out of service. And you also have to look at other things like performance monitoring. So if you approve this decision or approve this change to the license, monitor the result and the effects of that and see if it made sense or if we need to do something else. So I think it's more than just using the PRA number as the sole basis for our decision. It's really looking at, again, what do the regulations require, what margins exist, the Defenseindepth that's there, and oh, by the way, if you do have some quantitative insights from PRA technology, consider those, and then look at what type of performance monitoring you can do. So I think that kind of helps us in general get to what we would consider this question of adequate protection that you're talking about.
As part of this transformation, are people allowed to bring out-of-the-box thinking into the mix?
I think so. And one of the things that I had been reflecting on quite a bit, because we're going through a lot of our internal efforts to, help create a vision for what it means to be a modern risk-informed regulator. So I was talking about risks about nuclear power plant operation and use of nuclear technologies. There's another element of risk that I think is important to also think about is being able to take risks, right? What I said before was that we don't regulate to zero risks, right? We have to realize that every decision we make, there may be some risk associated with that, but we have to overcome that fear that we have to take risks.
Because there's also a risk with not doing anything, right? There's a risk with complacency.
Exactly. So saying just doing what you always have done because that's what we've always done. And again, I don't know if that's what I'm saying exactly in terms of taking risks, because there is a doing what we've always done element that I want to share with you. But what I'm talking about in terms of your question with, what'd you say, thinking outside the box?
Out of the box thinking.
We need that right now.
Yeah.
And I think that's what the outside world does. I really was fortunate recently last week. I had a chance to visit with some innovative companies that are outside nuclear, just to see how an innovative tech startup thinks, how they achieve success, how they align around a vision and a purpose. And what I found from that, Brett, is that there's a strong bias towards risk taking, right? They take the right risks, right? They do their homework, they study it, they look at what the risks are, what the probabilities of failure are, and what can they take to mitigate those risks, but they take the risks, they try things, right? That's how they learn. Being a risk taker, a theme I heard in going to some of these companies was that, they talked about failing often and failing early.
Mm-hmm.
So you identify the problems.
It's a Silicon Valley mantra.
That's where I was. I was in Silicon Valley, and it was a really enlightening experience to see how they think out there. And again, I'm not advocating that the NRC turn into we go into the wild west and that we're going to become Silicon Valley and take major risks in everything we do. That's not what I'm saying at all. But I think we need to challenge ourselves, right? If we just do what we've done all the time and following our processes and procedures, there's no risk in that, right? Because you could always point to, well, this is all what we've always done, right? It takes 5 years to do a regulatory review. This is what we've always done, right? If we're going to challenge ourselves to do it sooner, do it more efficiently, right? We're going to ask some people to take some risks in terms of looking at different ways to do the work to get to the same safety finding.
It's interesting you bring up that specific example, because that's one that's been on the back of my mind as well. Because I know, what it's like to start a company. You only have so many resources, and I can only imagine that, as these companies are kind of budgeting out, hey, we only have so much money. If we assume that we're going to be spending 5 years through the regulatory process, okay, well, that's money that we can't spend on other things that might have made it safer, or that might have brought new materials into the mix. And so it seems to me that by tackling that amongst other ways of doing things that would drive up cost, you can actually allow for the outcome you always desired, which was better performing plans.
Yep, exactly. So I do think there's, going back to your original question about thinking outside the box, that's certainly something I'm asking my team here to do, to just challenge some of our basic assumptions, ask why we're doing certain things a certain way.
Can I ask you about one in particular that's been on the back of my mind? Defenseindepth itself. Would you guys be willing to hear an argument counter to the fundamental core of the nuclear world, Defenseindepth?
I'm open to listening to any type of argument here. I think part of us trying to be a really risk-informed regulator does mean that we have to be flexible and willing to listen to other alternatives about how to meet some of the traditional criteria and concepts and philosophies that we've applied in the regulatory process. Sure, if somebody comes up with an alternative to the Defenseindepth approach, I'd actually love to hear about it, because what's interesting about Defenseindepth, that's an internationally recognized concept,
I know, but it's so funny. So I come from the mechanical engineering world. And I've tracked the history of many different technologies. They used to make cars a certain way. They used to make the frame as strong as possible, right? That's almost like the car version of Defenseindepth.
Right.
And then they realized that in the case of an accident, well, you don't want it to be as strong as possible. You want it to have a crumple zone. And so the auto industry had to throw away their Defenseindepth in the name of safety. They made it safer without Defenseindepth. They had a predictable failure mode that led to less consequence rather than trying to prevent failure of the frame of the vehicle.
Right. So, but it's interesting on that one, Brett, because if I think about it, I would say, like, let's say if you go from these really rigid frames to the crumple zone, and then now you introduce airbags and new technologies, which is a great thing because actually innovation in technology can actually improve safety, and the automobile industry is a prime example of that. I don't necessarily see it as completely throwing away the Defenseindepth concept. I just maybe look at it more of adding a different type of layer of Defenseindepth. Now you have another way to address the issue.
Right. So now here's where maybe I should pose a challenge directly to Defenseindepth. Sometimes adding another layer stands in contrast to the effectiveness
Mm-hmm.
of any given mode of operation. So for instance, something I've always hypothesized is, well, why don't you just kind of dig a 300-foot hole before you build your plant, and then if anything goes wrong, just drop the core in the hole.
Mm-hmm.
But that does stand in contrast to Defenseindepth, even though, granted, I haven't built any models for this.
Right.
One could say, hey, that's actually made you safer because at least you know where the core is.
Right.
Yeah, you melted the core, you trashed everything, but you know what? It's in a 300-foot hole underground, not a big deal. But that would prevent you from adding all these extra layers and layer after layer after layer that might be integrated, not let you drop the core down a hole.
Yeah. So and what you're saying in terms of now I understand what you're saying about looking at Defenseindepth a little bit differently. And I would say that in practice, we actually are kind of doing a little bit of what you're suggesting here. And very recently, the NRC staff, were looking at an issue, and this is in the Office of New Reactors related to an SMR design that we're currently looking at. And there was a policy paper sent up to the commission where the applicant was looking for the agency to take a different position on a, let's say, philosophy that we've applied for certain components, this so-called single failure. Right? They asked the commission to not apply the criterion of single failure to this one valve in the safety system there. And the staff looked at that and determined that if we didn't apply the single failure criterion there, it would result in some reduction of Defenseindepth, but that the overall consequences were sufficiently low that it could be an acceptable approach. So I think we're really open to look at how many layers of Defenseindepth we need, and those sort of 5 general principles I was mentioning to you before, and I'm actually quoting those from a regulatory guide that we use in our decision making, which is, again, what are the regulations require, the Defenseindepth, the safety margins, any quantitative risk information we might have, and the type of performance monitoring we can do. It's not 100% of everything. I think there's this balance, and this is where some judgment applies. I've been rereading this book I was looking at years and years ago. I had taken this course at the Kennedy School of Government. It was on the regulatory craft, and it was a book written by Malcolm Sparrow, and he talks a lot about the regulatory craft and what's really needed for safety authorities. And it's not a black and white world. You have to apply some judgment and common sense of what's reasonable.
Yeah.
Because if we go to the extreme in what we think needs to be done to go to zero risk, I don't know if that's necessarily in the public's interest, because it could be done at a great cost. I mean, it could, in terms of how many resources we need to drive things down to zero risk in our regulatory reviews. That means we would have to basically redo the design if we really wanted to go into zero risk, right? So we have to be willing to accept some level of risk, and there are some trade-offs, I would say, in terms of how much Defenseindepth do we have? Okay, maybe you don't have every single layer there, but you have enough margin that it might be okay. And by the way, we're dealing with a very, very low probability accident sequence. Overall, we think it's reasonable, that we would have reasonable assurance of safety.
And how do we think about, because with one of these calculations in PRA, probabilistic risk assessment, is this notion of like consequences, all that's factored into it. You got to multiply the likelihood of something happening by the consequence. Yeah. Have we readjusted our notion of consequence as we've learned more from the various nuclear accidents that have occurred? So for instance, let's say Chernobyl, when it first happened, we thought, oh my God, it was going to lead to all these solid state cancers. And then now that so much time has passed, we've relooked at the data and we said, oh my God, the only isotope that hurt anyone in Chernobyl, and Chernobyl's way worse than a light water reactor, is iodine-131. That is the only one that has hurt anyone in the public. So have we taken a look at that and then tried to recalibrate our notion of what is the consequence of a meltdown?
Yeah, so I can't speak with expert knowledge on what we've done in sort of the let's say the radiation protection world. There's like international committees dedicated to radiation protection and looking at things like you were just describing with, what dose limits are and what isotopes really contribute to that. And I know that's things that are currently being considered right now, like, for example, the linear no threshold theory, right? That it seems every now and then
Don't
people
get me
come back
started on the
and going
LNT.
back to that, to revisiting the LNT. So I can't really speak to that. I guess from the area that I'm directly responsible for in the safety of operating reactor facilities, I think we are learning from events such as Fukushima, for example. We do know that even though there are rare extreme natural events that can occur, they can occur. So having some level of protection for these rare events, the agency deemed appropriate. So we did recently revise our regulations to make requirements to have some mitigating strategies in place to deal with these extreme events. And this is what resulted in the so-called flex equipment that's at all the operating nuclear power plants in the country, where there's diverse means of using portable equipment to supply cooling water and power supplies to the plant in the event of one of these unlikely events.
And the notion with this flex equipment is that some equipment is located off-site, but can be quickly and easily transported to any given number of locations and hooked into the on-site equipment.
Yeah, so it's actually kind of like that, but there's maybe another layer in between. There's things on site as well. So whether it's inside the fence of the power plant or just outside the fence, that's just a nuance there. But each nuclear power plant has a set of equipment there that they can just get immediately to address an issue. If let's say they lose all their emergency diesel generators and they need to get electrical power, they have portable generators they can hook up and supply electrical power to power up the safety equipment. I think what you were referring to are the off-site locations in the United States where there are basically two big warehouses full of portable equipment that can be delivered to any site in the country within 24 hours. So there's significant additional mitigation capability today that did not exist before the Fukushima accident. In fact, it was actually an outgrowth of what we put in place after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. And in fact, I was kind of directly involved in that toward the later stages of implementing what we called, I hate to use the specific jargon here, but B5B. On February 25th, 2002, the NRC issued some orders to all the power plants to do a number of things to increase their level of security at the sites. But then also we ordered our power plants to have equipment in place to deal with losses of large areas of the plant due to fires and explosions, right? So you lose a big part of the plant, you need to get portable equipment there. So that was the so-called B5, it was section B.5.B, Bravo 0.5, Bravo, right? To use the nuclear phonetic alphabet there. And that was put in place, and we went through this period of time where we were basically putting it into each power plant's license. Even though they had an order, we ended up with a condition of each license that they would have this equipment. And we ended up with a license condition, and they got all this portable equipment. And I remember at that time, because I was responsible for project managing all the licensing activities to get those things in place, and we were going out and looking at the equipment they put in place and seeing if it lined up with the industry guidelines that they had developed. And I remember, I think I was at Duane Arnold, actually. I was at Duane Arnold doing a tour. It was like, Duane Arnold's like in Iowa, and I was out there in the winter, so it probably wasn't the best time to go. Or maybe it was a winter. I actually can't even remember now. But I remember walking around the site and looking at what they had put in place and all the additional mitigation equipments, the temporary hookups, And I thought to myself, this is probably one of the best things we've done in terms of increasing the ability of a site to get cooling water and electrical power to where it needs to go during an accident. I said, wow, this is really good. I'm glad this stuff is here now. So I think stuff like that is, I don't know what question we were on originally, but I do think that type of, this was learning from events. Like we learned from a security event here that, hey, you could have the potential to lose a loss of a large area of the plant. Let's get some mitigation capability in place. And we did that. So we learned from it. And similarly, that learning was even further extended after the Fukushima accident, because we saw the type of devastation in the tragic events in Japan.
So you've combined these two offices, and there's probably, as far as I can be tracking through the podcast, there's a lot of new companies out there. There's a lot of interest in bringing new reactor technologies to
Yep.
market.
Yeah.
Do they all come through you now? How does this work when a new technology wants to come to the NRC and say, hey, we've got a new idea? What's the process for them to do so?
So I'd say they already are coming to the NRC. So there are a number of advanced reactor designers. So I'm talking non-light water designs now that have already been engaging with the NRC in pre-application discussions on the regulatory process and what it would take to license a design or certify a design or perhaps even license a facility. So, we have Part 50, we have Part 52, and there's pros and cons depending on which one you want to choose.
Is one of those paths better than another for an advanced reactor technology?
I can't, I'm probably not in the best position to pick one over the other. I think each potential applicant, they're doing their own review of the licensing strategy that makes the most sense for them. So I think either of those processes would work for the NRC. I mean, we can get our job done in either one. I think that's more of a call for the applicant to pick which one they think would be better.
But both of them were designed with your traditional light water reactor in mind. So for the advanced reactor technology companies, do they just have to go through line by line and just file exception because it's too small, or exception because we don't have a pressure of this? Or...
Yep. So right now, our body of regulations are based on 20th century technology, right? They're not light water design, so a lot of the things are just not applicable for an advanced reactor, like a molten salt reactor with liquid fuel. I mean, the core's already melted, right? So we're looking at a different licensing approach in terms of, or let's say a different approach in terms of what the design needs to address. We had issued advanced reactor design criteria, which were sort of the advanced reactor versions of the general design criteria that are in those books.
And can they use those those alterations that you issued? Can they say, hey, we want to go? We're ready to transition from pre-application to application. Mm-hmm. Can they do that? Can they just say we're going to use the modified?
Yeah, I mean that's what they're there for. Right?
Have any of them? None of them have entered application phase.
Not yet. We're only in pre-application discussions. I would also say that very recently, I want to say in April of this year, but don't quote me on the exact date. I think it was April. We published for comment, or it might have been later than that. I'm not sure, but we published, and because this is in the new reactor office, so I'm slowly coming up to speed on that. But we published for comment this licensing modernization plan, where we're looking at a different framework for selecting what type of events need to be analyzed for an advanced reactor, so that essentially you can get to which systems need to be safety related and which ones don't. So it's a completely different approach. What I would say in terms of kind of your question about that, a lot of these companies with interest, that they're already having some discussions with NRC, I'd like to tell you that we're actually asking ourselves, how can we do our reviews differently here, right? We, from where I sit, it makes no sense to me to take an advanced reactor, which significantly different and better safety features, to force fit that into the normal way we would review a power plant.
And then just license by exception. So you're saying we should have a different, before we try to push one of them down that path of licensing by exception, we should come up with a different framework altogether.
And I'm really referring more to actually how we even do the review. So for example, when we do a design certification review of a big, large light water reactor, or we do a major licensing action here in NRR, we take that complex licensing action and we break it up into its component parts. And we have our sort of technical silos look at their own corner of the world, sometimes through a straw, and that's all they see is the electrical system. Well, what I'm suggesting is that we take a more integrated review of an advanced reactor design, that we put a team of experts, we get the fuels people, the electrical people together, and any other specialized skill sets that we need and other support functions, and they're looking at the design in a more integrated fashion. If they need to bring in some expertise in a very niche area, they bring that expertise in to help generate an overall safety conclusion. So I think if we can work differently,
Yeah.
I think we can really still accomplish our mission, but probably in a much more efficient way than just breaking it up into small components and trying to put it together in the end.
I love that. I love that process. And that's okay. So now I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, because you also mentioned maybe they shouldn't take 5 years, and now we've got this kind of new way of thinking about how to regulate an advanced reactor. Do we think that we could maybe get this, like we could put this in place and get it done within 2 or 3 years?
I can tell you what one person thinks. I mean, certainly we have set some milestones. You know, we have the Nuclear Energy Innovation and Modernization Act that place some requirements on the NRC, especially in the areas of advanced reactor activities. And we owed to Congress some milestones of how long we think it would take, and we had informed them, but we were certainly not looking at a 4 or 5 year review. We were looking at something closer to 24 months. I'd actually like to challenge my staff to even beat that.
That's awesome.
You know, there's things that we do here in our current processes, like for example, we write huge safety evaluation reports for these design certifications that we do. You know, the applicant submits a lot of material to us. Sometimes we use verbatim the words that they used in their submittal. We put it into our safety evaluation saying, okay, these are what the requirements say, here's how it meets it. But I think if we just took a fundamental look at the product we're actually producing, maybe there's a different way to do it, right? In some countries, for example, the applicant provides a safety case to the regulator. And the regulator does a very thorough, comprehensive review, and they send a letter back that says, we've reviewed your application, we find it meets our regulations, and it's approved, right?
I
and
see.
It's
So it's unstructured, but achieves the goals that are necessary to achieve.
Right. So it would take us into a different paradigm if we were going to do something
Could
like
you guys do something like that? Could someone just approach you and say, hey, I want to do it this way? Could you guys assemble a team to say, you know what, for this case, we are going to do that. We don't need to pass a new law. We don't need congressional mandate. We are going to do it that way.
Yeah, so I look at this as just fundamentally management, right? It's up to, you know, my team here to manage the project in a way that most efficiently uses the resources we've been entrusted to manage. Right? I think that going back to what we were talking about very early on in the conversation about this transformation we're on and being a risk-informed regulator, in addition to being able to better understand the risks to make good decisions on adequate protection, another reason why we need to do that is that we make sure that we spend our time and effort on those issues that matter most towards safety. Right? I'll give you a really good example. So we've had a very long-standing technical issue that we had open for decades. This is the so-called generic safety issue 191 related to the performance of the sumps where the emergency core cooling systems would draw suction off of in an accident. We had been studying that for decades, and we had still continued to study it for more years. I don't know how long it would have lasted, but you know, when I came back to the NRC in the fall of last year, I was just looking at some of the things we were working on, and I said, well, geez, we're still doing activity on GSI 191. I said, well, how is this further investment of resources going to improve safety of the plants today? Nobody could really answer that question. So, you know what we did? We developed the technical basis to justify the closure, that there was the safety gains had been achieved through the modifications that were made when the generic issue was initially opened, but that there was no reason to do any further study. So to me, this is just using risk information. So we use risk information and our knowledge of the plants to consider what was reasonable, and we believe that the plants are safe, right? They're operating today. They've been operating the whole time since the generic safety issue was open, but we learned a lot from it. It's not saying that it wasn't useful, and plants are safer today than they were when the issue was first opened up, right? Because all the pressurized water reactors put bigger sump strainers in there to ensure that the debris doesn't clog up the suction to the pumps. So it just made sense to us to be risk-informed, to say we're not going to add a lot more value and safety for the amount of resources we plan on spending here. So
something that came to mind as you're talking about all this, my former life was in the drone world. And, you know, aviation, like nuclear, you know, there's a regulator there, there's safety concerns there,
right.
You know, there's a lot going on. And one of the things that we were trying to argue is, you know, kind of like some of these advanced reactors, hey, the new drones are very different than your 747 that flies in the sky.
Yeah.
And yet were being held to the exact same regulatory standard. And these were, small
Right.
drones that you might see in your backyard. And so we brought this concern to them, and they said, you know what? You're right. Well, we're going to try to develop a new set of regulations for drones, for smaller vehicles. But before we do that, because we know that's going to take a long time, and we need to collect some data to really understand how these things perform, we're going to put a threshold at 1 kilogram. Anything under 1 kilogram is not under our purview to protect the public in terms of safety. And they acknowledged, they said, yes, actually something under 1 kilogram could hurt somebody. It could crash into their head. It could, fly into another helicopter or something. But you know what? We have to draw a threshold somewhere.
Right.
And this is going to lead to net safety improvements in the future for all aviation vehicles. Because the theory was, if you allow the proliferation of a new technology at a level where there is hardly any consequence, though still some consequence, new safety technologies will be developed on that platform. We'll get new sensors, we'll get optical avoidance, we'll get lasers, we'll get all this type of stuff. And it happened. So they allowed for the commercial opportunity for these very low risk vehicles to proliferate. And it's now leading into technologies, I kid you not, that are finding their way into aircraft of all shapes and sizes, such as digitized traffic management modes and such. And I almost wonder if there is a parallel here. If one could make the argument, hey, listen, let's draw a threshold for a research-sized reactor. And I know there's different regulations for research reactors, but let's say that we want to create commercial opportunity. So for a research-sized reactor that does create power that can be sold to a utility, if we can say, you know what, one can make the case that even in the case of a meltdown, the potential source term release is so insignificant. I mean, if it's less than 1 megawatt, that means it would be 1,000 times less than Fukushima or a gigawatt scale reactor. One can say at that little source term release, it doesn't pose a significant threat to the public. Have at it, guys. And then you'll see all these amazing technologies developed that can be used to be implemented in bigger plants. What do you think about that?
So I think you're kind of describing the innovation cycle and how innovation leads to further improvements in other areas. And I'm a believer in that. And when I look at innovation in nuclear, I think in the advanced reactor area, there are some basic requirements that we expect design to meet. Basically at the site boundary, you want the dose to be, we're talking about consequences and we're looking for the doses to be a certain level, right? How you get there, right? And for large light water reactors, we specified a lot of prescriptive ways to help ensure that the doses during an accident would not exceed a certain level. I think for advanced reactors, exactly what you're just talking about, right? Much different, much lower source term, lower pressures as well, right? So there are a lot of factors that feed into what could drive the dose at the site boundary. So where I'm getting at is that we're actually doing some things already that are paving the way for these technologies to be able to be licensed to make sure we don't have an unacceptable dose at the site boundary. Like, for example, emergency planning zones and functional containments are things that we're considering, that we're not thinking about using the same exact criteria that we're using for large light water reactors. And again, it's done in a way, we're focused on the consequences, which is what we care about, right? We want to not have any undue risk to the public. And we've set those thresholds in the rules. But these advanced reactors, in my view, it seems like their safety features, in the lower source term and the lower pressures, I think will offer significantly different ways to be able to demonstrate that they meet those.
But I guess what I'm asking is there any boundary conditions that someone could set where you guys agree, hey, this is actually no longer within our purview to impose a regulatory burden? For instance, if it is small enough and if it's digitally remotely controlled, someone can make the argument, hey, we proved to you that there's no source term release beyond the site boundary, and there's no workers in the facility. So you've agreed there is no case that anyone could ever be hurt by this, even in the worst case scenario. Why do we have to go through all the NQA1 stamps for all of our parts there?
So Brett, we're actually thinking about this stuff already in terms of like in the ASME codes and things of that nature, because some of the stuff just may not be necessary. Obviously, there's always the exemption route, right? You got some advanced reactor designs that people are thinking about, we don't even need operators.
Yeah,
okay?
Exactly.
Right?
Which huge safety benefit.
Right. So the challenge it will place upon the NRC is to be able, can we make that final determination that as the reactor design is proposed and how it's intended to be operated, is it still safe? Like, we have to make that judgment, okay? And it's going to require us to perhaps go into, to leave behind some old paradigms, right? The old paradigm is, oh my goodness, you got to have all these operators in the control room, right? But do you really need to have that? I think we have the ability to make that determination, and if we judge it that it's safe, if you didn't have operators, you could seek an exemption to the rule. You know, the commission in that SMR example about that valve and the single failure criterion, the commission's direction to staff was very interesting because it said something to the effect of, in all NRC licensing and regulatory activities, we are to, the NRC staff shall, I would say shall was the word, I'd have to read, I don't have it memorized, but it says in all of our regulatory activities, we shall consider risk insights and consider those risk insights as appropriate when, how is it worded? It said, we shall consider risk insights in all regulatory decisions that we'll apply those risk insights when deterministic criteria are not needed for adequate protection, right? So it's kind of doing what you're trying to say, that, hey, the risk is so low that the deterministic criteria aren't necessary, right? That's what that direction fundamentally told me, that in those cases, we need to consider risk insights when that if the deterministic criteria are not needed for reasonable assurance, then we do what we need to do.
So to take this to the extreme example, I could propose tomorrow a reactor. I dig a hole 4 miles underground, put a reactor under there, power cable comes up, fill the whole hole with concrete, and you guys could regulate that. And you guys could say, run a model that says, hey, there's no chance there's any risk here. We'll fast track this through in 12 months.
I think we'd have to look at what the requirements are, and
I was fishing there.
But then again, from a designer's perspective, you'd say, well, is it economically feasible to really do that?
But that's up to the company, right? That's not up to the regulator.
But so this is where the pre-application discussions are very, very helpful. When they come in, they look at the body of framework here, and they're looking at their design in conjunction with what the regulatory requirements are, where they might need exemptions, where they might have some questions on how we might be able to meet this certain regulatory requirement. And that's where the conversation with the regulator comes in. And that gives us an idea to think about, well, geez, how could we do a safety review here and make a safety finding in this case? What kind of information do we need? Do we need any data or simulation or modeling information? So in terms of the advanced reactor activities, I find it just an incredible opportunity for the NRC here. I think you probably read in the news that yesterday the chairman of the NRC, along with the president of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, signed a memorandum of cooperation that fits in under the broader cooperation agreement between the U.S. and Canada on nuclear activities to partner on regulatory reviews of advanced reactors. And I think that provides a tremendous opportunity for two like-minded regulators, again, focused on safety, to work together to do a partnered review. I think that's a very efficient way. We're smart, the Canadians are smart, and we're going to kind of work together and leverage the combined knowledge we have to do something more efficiently. And I think it's a fascinating opportunity. And I'm kind of looking at advanced reactors as, it's not my role as a director of NRR to promote nuclear energy. That's not why I'm here. My role is the regulation and what's needed for safety for the American people. But when I think about the attitudes in our country toward nuclear, right? There's a societal debate going on right now about nuclear and what role it might play in a low carbon or no carbon economy, or whether it's to just purely address climate change. That's up for the private sector and federal and local lawmakers to decide whether they want to use nuclear. Okay, it's not my decision to make. But where the NRC is important, I think people recognize that the NRC is actually the fundamental enabler for that to actually happen, right? So you have private sector investment, Department of Energy investment going into advanced nuclear, right? There's bipartisan support for advanced nuclear technologies. Where I see the NRC's role as being really, really important is that we make safe nuclear technologies possible. Can't do it without the NRC. And that's the mindset that I'd like the NRR to approach our work in advanced reactors. Quite frankly, that mindset should apply for the operating fleet as well, right? We're not trying to make things impossible, right? We have to be a diligent safety regulator, right? Because our mission in the end is to make sure that the public is protected. I mean, we got to do that. We'll never, ever forget that. But we're not trying to make things impossible. And I think certainly with the advanced reactors, I think I've got a number of really enthusiastic staff that are really looking at different ways of going through a licensing review. I told you we developed the advanced reactor design criteria. We have a licensing modernization project in place. I mean, we are really looking to make sure that we do our role and we do it well. And we do it in a way that isn't like how we did it before. 5 years to review, these micro reactors that, as you're talking about, have, very, very small source terms, low pressure. We're just asking ourselves, what are the true risks and what's safe? So I'm really, really excited for the two offices coming together. I think we're doing a lot of great things at NRC. We've been criticized a lot in the past for being very inflexible and maybe not being very risk informed. And I'd say, yes, there have been cases where that's been true for the NRC. But every day I spend here, I'm seeing more and more positive examples of really just dedicated folks at NRC that want to kind of restore the reputation that, we are going to be a modern government. We're going to use modern IT tools, and that part of visiting some of these, non-nuclear companies to look at how they think, this, cliche out of the box thinking, taking risk. I think that's what is great about being at NRC today. And plus what I'd also add to that, Brett, is that, we've always got to be thinking of the future leaders of the NRC. Okay, the newer generations of nuclear professionals work different, right? They grew up in the digital age. They're digital natives, right? They collaborate, they communicate differently. The millennials and the Generation Zs, if you read the literature about these generational cohorts, they look for work that's meaningful, like they can associate themselves with a cause. And to me, right now, what greater cause is there than making possible safe nuclear technologies for the American people, right? It's not make it impossible, right? NRC has the ability to make safe nuclear an option for the United States of America. Again, it's not up to us to promote it, but if we approach our job with that mindset rather than figuring out why it should be impossible, I think the world would just be a better place. Again, it doesn't compromise what we're supposed to do in terms of meeting our safety mission, but I just believe right now, today, Brett, that it's a really exciting time to be at NRC because there's so many new things happening. I mean, it's just, to me, it's incredible, right? Vogtle Unit 3 and 4, the mindset that we're trying to create for the people that are doing NRC's regulatory activities for Vogtle Unit 3 and 4 are to make sure that we do our job in a way that makes, safe technologies possible. Right, and we're coming up to the finish line hopefully really soon with Vogtle 3 and 4 as we're doing our construction oversight activities for that project in Georgia.
So, thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, Brett. It was great to talk to you. I really enjoyed this. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay.